Well, it's Tuesday morning, everybody. So glad you've joined me for this devotion today. We are in Deuteronomy chapter 8. Deuteronomy chapter 8. And what I wrote at the top of my journal page for this chapter after reading it and thinking about it was, when I think too highly of myself and too little of God. And when I think too much of me and not enough about God. In this chapter, Moses reminds the people of all the ways that God tested them, but also blessed them and provided for them during the 40 years wandering in the wilderness. For instance, in chapter 8 at verse 3, he mentions he fed you with manna. And in verse 4, he mentions that your clothing did not wear out on you. Man, I would love that. My clothing to last, and I wouldn't have to go buy any more new clothes. So their clothes didn't wear out during those 40 years of wandering. That's a miracle. He also says in verse 4 at the end of it that your feet, their feet did not swell. In other words, they didn't get twisted ankles and I guess gout in their feet, and they didn't get blisters. God miraculously protected their feet because remember, they were walking in the wilderness in the desert for 40 years. Those were blessings of God. And then in verse 4, with all the walking, that it's just these practical ways that God blessed them during those 40 years. Now, they're getting ready to go into the promised land. So they've had all those blessings. Now God says, I'm getting ready to bless you with this land you all have been dreaming of. Flowing with milk and honey, a good land that would provide for them a good, comfortable living. In verses 7 and following, he talks about that. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land of brooks of water, of fountains and springs, flowing forth in the valleys and hills. In verse 8, a land of wheat and barley, of vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of olive oil and honey, a land where you will eat food without scarcity, in which you will not lack anything, a land whose stones are iron and out of whose hills you can dig copper. In other words, I'm taking you to a good place that will provide for you a good life. And he says their response to these gifts and blessings of God should be, verse 10, when you have eaten and are satisfied, you shall bless the Lord your God for the good land which he has given you. You should be grateful and give God thanks, praise God, worship God, and bless God for all of those blessings. He also mentions in verse 1 that you shall be careful to do, and also in verse 6 of chapter 8, therefore you shall keep the commandments of the Lord your God to walk in his ways and to fear him. So their response is supposed to be gratitude, thanksgiving, praise, worship, and obedience. Obedience, doing what God says. Now, that's supposed to be their response to these blessings. That's the response you and I should have to the blessings that God gives us. But they faced a certain temptation, as do we. And the temptation they would face and the temptation that we face is found in verses 11 and following, when he says, beware that you do not forget the Lord your God by not keeping the commandments. Don't forget God. When you disobey God, it's because you're not thinking about God. You're forgetting God, ignoring God. Verse 12, otherwise, when you have eaten and are satisfied, when God's blessed you, and you've built good houses and lived in them, and when your herds and your flocks multiply, and your silver and gold multiply, and all that you have multiplies, when your life gets really comfortable and you're not poor anymore, then, now here's the temptation, then your heart will become proud, and you will forget the Lord your God, who brought you out from the land of Egypt and out of the house of slavery. Wow. Verse 17, otherwise you may say in your heart, my power and the strength of my hand made me this wealth. In other words, When God blesses, the temptation we face is to start thinking, I did it. I earned it. I deserved it. I accomplished it. Look at me, not God. You forget God, then start disobeying God. I've seen that happen many times as a pastor in the lives of people. It is possible that you and I, because we forget, ignore, and stop obeying God, stop giving Him the glory, it is possible that we take the very blessings of God and turn them into a curse. The very gifts that God gave us can become the very things that we allow to turn our hearts away from Him as we begin thinking wrong, feeling wrong, deciding wrong, living wrong. That's a scary thing. When God's blessings start keeping you out of church, when God's blessings cause you to think about what you want and less about what He wants, the cure and protection for all of that is found in verse 18 when He says, you shall remember the Lord your God, for it is He who is giving you power to make wealth. Listen, everything you achieve in life, you achieve because God created you with the capacity to do it. Without God creating you that way, you couldn't do any of it. You couldn't accomplish anything, earn anything, do anything, make anything, have anything, if it wasn't for God creating you with the brain and everything else capable of achieving it. But we forget that and start thinking too highly of ourselves and too little of God. You see, one of the reasons you need to keep serving until your body says you can't anymore, one of the reasons you need to give a tithe, 10% of your income to the Lord, and then the wealthier you become, more than a tithe, to be generous. One of the reasons you need to consistently show up at the Lord's house on Sunday is to remind you that every good thing you have in life and every blessing you have in life came from the hand of God. And if you had a hand in accomplishing it, it's because He gave you that hand, that ability, that talent, that brain to do it. And without Him, you would be and have nothing. And these consistent things, these consistent disciplines of praying and being in God's house on Sunday and of tithing and being generous, of continuing to serve, remind us of that. See, it's not just that we're doing for God, it's that these disciplines remind us where all these gifts came from, because we are tempted to forget God as we begin enjoying His blessings, and in so doing, allow His blessings to become the curse that turn our heart from God. Well, today's different than yesterday. I preached a little bit, but I'm a preacher. That's what I do. What are you going to do about it? How are you going to respond to what God is saying? To this sermon, if you will. I'll see you tomorrow.